we move into part two, we'll have that second panel get ready. And part two of today's conference is on creating educational opportunities. Panel A is going to focus on charter schools. This is going to be a 1 hour block as well, running from 10:45 to 11:45, at which point we'll take a 15-minute break before our noon keynote. Again, we hope to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for for discussion after the presentation and discussion, after the panel, in this case for audience Q&A. Again, for those of you who are watching and listening from around the country and the world, please type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the webinar. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the panel, and I plan to pose a few of your questions at the end of the panel. And again, a reminder that we are recording today's event. So if the next group would take the stage, I know that Dr. Deb McGriff is unable to join us this morning and let us know this morning that she had an urgent matter and was unable to be a part of the panel. But we will be joined by the chair of this discussion, Ambassador Boyden Gray. And I think I see you, Ambassador, preparing here to join the stage. He's the founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates, a law and strategy firm in Washington, D.C., focused on constitutional and regulatory issues. Under President George W. Bush, he was the U.S. ambassador to the European Union and the U.S. Special Envoy to Europe for Eurasian Energy. He worked in the White House for 12 years, first as counsel to the vice president during the Reagan administration. Mr. Ambassador, over to you for this morning's panel on charter schools.
Thank you very much. Can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you, but I cannot see you, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, let me see if I can. Yeah, I don't know why I can't be seen. There's just something.
Well, we can hear you, Mr. Ambassador, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay. We have two panelists, very qualified. Mackie Raymond, who was the founding director of the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes, probably the premier think tank, if you will, for understanding trends and results in the charter school movement. She's now looking into how to increase competition and data reliability. And she's at Stanford, had a career before that at the University of Rochester. I think she's as qualified on the studies as anybody. The second is Nina Reese, who's been more involved in the, hope she won't be offended by this, in the politics. She's head of the national founder and head of the National Public Charter School Association, and she has done probably more than anybody I know to promote nationally public awareness of charter schools, their promise, their results, and I'm very happy to have her appear because she can help with some of the political questions that I think I'm going to raise if they don't. Before I turn over to our first speaker, I just would like to say that I sort of have four general questions. One that jumps out is the improvement that the studies discussed this morning seem to show is a clear gap, if you will, improvement gap from Black Americans in inner cities, that they have improved more than district school counterparts. That's very powerful evidence. It's not surprising to me, or I bet you to Nina Reese. It just hasn't been disseminated to the public. And there are reasons for that. We can get into that maybe as to why this information has been kind of muzzled. One wonders, given the success, why has momentum for expanding charter schools slowed? I wasn't really aware that it had slowed significantly. In fact, I thought it had increased in many ways. But it may be because of pushback from the teacher unions who fear, I would hope that the explanation would be that they fear the success of this program and of this development, and they just don't want to let it grow anymore. Certainly there are limitations in almost every city as to how far charter schools can expand. And in Washington, D.C., where I come from and where I live, it's maybe other than Louisiana because of the hurricane, the highest charter school participation is nearly 50% of the whole educational population in the city, and it's done quite well, and there's some very good schools included. So, and then two other questions: what role is beyond the scope of this program, which was set up before COVID really hit, but does the success of some of these results, shown by some of these results, what impact does COVID have on this and opening up even more choice for parents? You see these pods, local community pods, grow up with parents banding together to open up a homeschooling operation, if you will, because the public schools aren't doing it. And then I would also wonder about, I know vouchers are not in the scope, but have they provided some competition to open things up? And A and B, has pressure on a broader voucher approach perhaps contributed to the lack of popularity or lack of momentum of charter schools? Maybe it's shifted a little bit to school choice. So without taking up any more time of the speakers, Maggie, would you please take over and give us the results of some of the great work that you've done?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this 25th anniversary celebration of PEPCI. And congratulations to Paul Peterson for so many years of leadership and guidance in creating such a valuable institution. So I am going to be talking more broadly about charter schools and their contribution to education policy today. I think the paper that Danny and Paul has put together have given us a lot to look at in terms of understanding longer term trends in charter performance. I think the more recent activity in charter schools is actually where I'm going to try to focus my attention and my discussion today. I want to start out by suggesting that the real value of the research that Peterson and Danny have produced, and that goes along with other studies that have been done about the performance of charter schools, isn't necessarily the performance at the average. What I really want to do is I want to draw your attention to the fact that in both sets of studies, we see a large number of schools in the charter sector that are just dramatically better. Not just a little bit better, but really substantially better, a year of additional learning every year. And I want to talk about the fact that the variation in the charter sector is completely unexplored and undervalued. And I think it's undervalued because those schools actually serve a very critical evidence proof. And I think they are the ones that are driving a lot of the pushback that is being experienced in the charter sector across the country. If you have hundreds and hundreds of schools across the country that are getting substantially superior results, the question inevitably arises, what are they doing and why can't that be done in other schools? And it's not a selection bias problem, it's an opportunity to improve practice problem that I think is creating those differences. I think the pace of innovation in the district setting is much, much slower. Charters use their flexibility to adapt and innovate and tweak their models continuously over time. And you do end up with these really dramatic examples, whether it's Success Academy, Achievement First, whether it's Democracy Prep with their civic education, whether it's Summit Public Schools. You end up with organizations that not only have a different way of thinking about education, but they've proven that they can scale it as well. And so that's where we have the opportunity that explains the strong performance of Black African American students in charter schools. That's where you get the urban charter school effects. It's because you've got a limited number of really, really strong producers who have been able to scale, and they're not getting the opportunity today to scale further or to share their knowledge. I think briefly, the hit of COVID is actually a double-edged sword for charter schools. I'd be very interested to hear what Nina has to say about that. I know from research that my team did this summer that charter schools in New York State, where we looked at all of the schools, they were able to get back to pivot to remote learning and get back to instruction much, much faster than district schools were able to. And the average was 4 days to get back into some form of remote instruction for their students. And they continue to tweak those models throughout the rest of the year. So I think the characteristics of charter schools set them up for success in a COVID-like situation. I think the idea that lots and lots of parents are looking for schools that are going to be supportive of students and families, that are going to be focused on instruction, mean that the enrollment patterns that we're going to see once the October statistics come out, charters are already reporting that they're fully subscribed, that they are completely waitlisted out by 100% or more. I think that speaks to the idea that the product characteristics and the value proposition of charter schools are extremely strong and positive. EdChoice just put together some data just released this week that shows the same thing. Here, I think the online charter providers, even though in past studies their performance academically has been miserable, I think they also are seeing an uptick in interest. And the positive thing about them is that at least they have experience in providing online education. So their operational experience puts them at a slight advantage. I just hope that they focus a little bit more in this period on the quality of instruction and the actual learning that's occurring. And finally, about vouchers, absolutely. This period is going to show us that a one-size-fits-all district-style model cannot possibly address all the needs of students, and that parents are wanting to exercise a much wider range of choice than we've seen up till now. So I think charters are well positioned to help respond to that, but I also think you're going to see a lot more pressure for vouchers in the coming period, particularly as schools struggle to reopen and families are frustrated with the kinds of support that their students are getting. So I think this is a period of choice. I think this is a period that's going to amplify the role of charters, and I think amplify the role of vouchers. So with that, I'll pause and I'll turn it over to Nina.
Great, thank you so much, Mackie. I too want to recognize Professor Peterson for his contributions and Pepsi's contributions to the whole area of school choice. And I'm very sorry that we cannot celebrate with you in person. I don't know how the reception at 5:30 is going to go, but eager for this discussion today and grateful that we're still able to have it. I really enjoyed reading this paper, partially because when the NAEP data for charters was first released in 2004, I believe, the evidence was not very positive. And I know Checker is with us today. He wrote a scathing article just highlighting how little charters have done. And at the time, the evidence that we showed when I was at the Department of Education was simply one of, okay, you cannot judge this by just looking at a snapshot. You have to look at the progress year over year. And despite the limitations of this study in terms of selection bias, I think it's fantastic that we're able to have something to point to that is based on the NAEP gold standard that demonstrates that over time, the gaps in the charter sector, especially for Black students, appear to be closing faster than the students in district schools. So, and we know, and I'm not a psychometrician and I don't know the NAEP data as intimately as those who presented the information did, but we also have a lot of evidence with the TUDA data that demonstrates, again, the charters in those cities where there are high concentrations of charters tend to do better, and certainly some evidence that that pressure is also potentially improving the overall quality of the public school system or the district school system in places like Washington, D.C. So anyway, so it's great to have this body of information, especially at this juncture where there's so much discussion about the impact of charter schools and whatnot. The other thing that's really timely about this discussion, of course, is Mackie and others have highlighted is COVID, not just the impact of COVID on education, but also what we're facing right now with the economic downturn, the political turmoil, the racial unrest. I think all of these factors are making people ask a lot more questions about education. I think more families are also gaining a new appreciation for the important roles that educators play, certainly what teachers do in the classroom every day, now that they have to serve as quasi-teachers and whatnot. To the question of how has the charter sector responded to COVID? We have a couple of bodies of research, or actually 3 that I've seen. One is done by SERPI. They looked at 18 charter networks, high quality networks, and they discovered that 16 out of the 18 switched to offering some sort of online learning almost immediately. And the last 2 did some sort of remote learning, even though it wasn't fully online. And we did a study just a couple weeks ago. It was released with Public Impact, looking at smaller networks. And we discovered that those smaller networks like Dream in New York, BRIA in Washington, D.C. and whatnot, they also pivoted very quickly. I'm not surprised by this because the autonomy that you get as a charter leader to manage your budget and make shifts in your staffing allows you to adjust to these types of things much faster.
I'm just listening.
If you look at district schools, the news in the early stages of COVID was centered around large districts not doing anything because they were worried about the provisions of special education and whether they would be able to equitably serve all of those students if they were doing fully remote arrangements. So charters pivoted quickly. They did whatever they could as fast as they could in order to adjust. And I have not seen any evidence countering that. In terms of the surge in numbers we've seen, and I think Matt Barnum is one of the attendees, he did a great piece in Chalkbeat that highlighted the increase in anecdotal evidence that there's definitely an increase in demand for virtual charters. But we won't know what the uptick is until later in the year. Our team is currently scrubbing the data so that we can give you accurate information. With all of that said, though, we talked a little bit about the slowdown in demand and what's leading to the plateauing of the growth of charter schools. And for that, I think I've talked about this Parthenon study that we did last year. But so the overall growth in terms of sheer numbers of people who are applying to open charter schools appears to have slowed down, at least as of last year. And one of the reasons for it, as NACSA and others have pointed to, has to do with fewer individuals actually applying to open charter schools. Now, why that's happening is a question mark. I think in some markets, it has a lot to do with market saturation potentially. In other places, it could be the politics. This area may not be as sexy as it once was in terms of attracting attention and capital. But one of the other key drivers of the slowdown of growth also has to do with the fact that districts used to authorize more charter schools and restructure their schools using the chartering model. And that is definitely has dipped over the years. With that said, the overall growth in terms of student growth has kept pace and continues to increase. And the demand for charter schools actually has continued to exist. So we have evidence through polling and everything else that demonstrates if a charter school were available to you, a lot of families would want to take advantage of it. So we haven't seen a shift in that over time, even though the growth rates of individual charters has been impacted. I'm also just going to say, look, despite all the evidence, one of the things that is kind of front and center for us is that all the evidence pointing to the effectiveness of charter schools, whether it's this NAEP study, whether it's the Credo study, all the randomized field trials that have been done in the past, those things unfortunately are no longer the types of things that lead the discussion. The discussion has definitely shifted to equity, whether charters are serving every student who's coming to them, are they doing so, are they in the way they promote their schools, are they truly accepting everyone and whatnot? And I think these are good discussions to have, but I also believe that they're discussions that the opposition throws our way when they notice they cannot argue the academic piece. And it's great for us to have these discussions. Certain sectors or certain states are more prone to having these discussions than the Northeast, for instance. But I think it's really important to not get too distracted by the claims that the opposition makes, because it's all rooted around whether if you're truly public, then you have to do all these other things. And in fact, what we should be saying is, well, perhaps some of these rules and regulations that the public sector is adhering to around collective bargaining agreements are the reason why these schools cannot pivot so quickly and make some of these corrections that charters have made. Yeah, I'm eager to field questions and see what others have to say. But again, this was a great contribution at the right time, as always, and I really enjoyed the coverage that this paper has already received in the Court of Public Opinion.
Ambassador Gray?
Yes, well, I'm glad to see that both of you discussed the COVID and potentially voucher school choice opportunities as an evolving paradigm that could really change the nature of teaching. Maybe I'm exaggerating the potential, but I see it all around me, with my own daughter and her my own young grandson. I think there's going to be more competition, and my own view, and I'd love to get a comment on this, my own view is that, and I think Dr. Hoxby did some good research on this, that where you have the competition like you do, say in DC with the KIPP schools and New York with Success Academies, it does improve all school outcomes. And so I hope that competition can be allowed to really explode, because in my own administrative law practice, nothing achieves results like old-fashioned competition. But before you get into the competitive question, just put again a question on why civil rights groups fight so hard the charter school movement, which is doing so much, especially for inner city Blacks. It's just something I don't understand. Joe Roberts, who headed the Washington Scholarship Fund, which I was a founding director, a charter program, at first privately funded, and then got a pilot grant from the U.S. government. We discussed it, and I would say to him, this is the civil rights issue of our time, and he would tell me that there are certain very high-ranking Black who had been Secretary of Transportation written the basic drafts in Brown versus Board of Education would order him or try to order him not to discuss choice, charters, vouchers as civil rights issues. And that's always sort of signaled to me that we've got to untangle the politics here a little bit before we can see an expansion of the opportunities that I think are out there and that are in demand by both students and parents, and in some cases, of course, grandparents.
So that's a great question. I don't know that the civil rights movement is opposed to charter schools. I think what you're referring to is the NAACP moratorium on charter schools that came into effect last year. You know, the face of the civil rights movement is fast changing. When you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, it is comprised of individuals who are charter supporters, former Teach for America teachers like Dory Mackison, and Brittany Packnett. So, you know, it's difficult. You know, I would say the old guard movement probably has more connections to the teachers' unions. They have been at their sides for a long time, and some of the discussions, unfortunately, you know, are the byproduct of that relationship. If you look at our movement, because we're so small, in those communities like Miami-Dade, we have relationships, or at least Governor Bush started the first charter school in Florida with the help of T. Willard Fair, who's the head of the Urban League of Greater Miami. One of the leaders of the Urban League in Austin, Texas, was on the board of IDEA Public Charter Schools. So you have pockets of places where the civil rights community or individuals with organizations like Unidos, for instance, have launched charter schools. Unidos actually has, this is the National Council of La Raza, which is not called Unidos, has a lot of charter schools that they're operating. So, you know, I think there's a disconnect right now between the constituency, the Black and Brown students who are benefiting from charter schools and want access to greater charter schools, and the leadership of some of these organizations. One last example, Margaret Fortune, the head of Fortune School in California, is a member of the local NAACP chapter, again, a huge advocate. So we definitely need to have more conversations. These conversations have to take place at the local level. And I think for the Black community in particular, I think those are conversations that are already being had, but it's going to take a while before it trickles up to the leadership. And there are certain things, obviously, that, you know, that they don't like for-profit charter schools. We all know there's no such thing as a for-profit charter school, but they're potentially talking about the management relationships with some for-profits. And so those discussions are going to vary state by state, because as all of us know, there are some of these for-profit management companies like Basis produce outstanding outcomes. And so the discussions need to really be centered around the particular markets where these communities are potentially being impacted by these organizations.
But could you get into the question of competition? How valuable do you think that concept is? I mean, do you agree that it could help or is helping?
Yes, of course. I and a lot of individuals, you know, came to this movement because we believe that by creating a competition, you'd be able to improve the overall quality of public education. But with that said, there's also a need for us to collaborate at different points in time, and just to talk about competition alone has not served us well, in my opinion. I think it's important to you know, cooperate, collaborate, demonstrate the efficacy of what we do, and the constant comparing and contrasting is not enough to sway public opinion.
Mackie, do you have anything to add from what you've learned?
Well, so I think the idea of the moment of COVID combined with the moment of attention to racial inequality actually does set up very, very well for a stronger conversation about the role of education and, by extension, the role of charter schools in producing outcomes for kids. I think there are a wide range of attitudes about what good education would look like in a more equitable environment, but I don't think that that ever walks away from the academics. And so, as Nina said earlier, diversifying the conversation around socio-emotional learning or about cultural competence or everything else ought to be and not instead of on the academic side. I do think that the current civil rights groups are highly focused on finding examples where African American students are not only enrolled, but included and valued and elevated, both individually and academically. And that really does point to the charter examples that Nina was talking about earlier and that we've highlighted in some of the work that we've done. I think there is a huge opportunity for advancing individuals of color in school leadership. And this is a place where I think we really have the flexibility in the charter sector is going to allow for a greater pace of change in that area. And I look forward to seeing that. The other thing that I think we want to acknowledge is that I think the ultimate outcome that many charter school operators have in mind for their students isn't a high school diploma. We recognize that the standards for high school graduation have been in flux for a long time. States are watering down their criteria. They're allowing all kinds of waivers in the COVID period. And I don't think that that changes the focus for a lot of charter school leaders. What they're looking at is setting students up for success after high school. So whether it's pursuing additional education or going to job training or going into employment, the focus is actually on preparing kids for that post-secondary life. And so I think the circumstances of our time right now are exactly the kind of field in which the smart discourse around what charter schools can offer and what they have been known to produce can only enhance the reputation of the sector and I think set them up for greater success moving forward.
Well, taking off from that comment, I'd like to, raise, I think it does allow me to raise the question of college performance and college completion, matriculation. It was always a frustration for me when I was involved with the Washington Scholarship Fund that we never were tracking the students once they had completed the 12 years and didn't know, this is when I was more involved in it, didn't know really what happened to them. My own daughter worked for 2 summers at the Washington Scholarship Fund, and it was her job to find out what happened to the first cohort of students that graduated. There were about 20 of them. And she tracked down 19, either directly or through their parents or grandparents and or guardians, and found that 19 of the ones that she were able to were all going to college, but we don't know whatever happened later. She was humbled because here she was the same age. She was 10th grade, about worrying about the college sweepstakes and the ups and downs of college applications, and she found that that was the same concern, of course, these kids she was talking to. And she realized that when it came to real anxieties, real worries, what their goals were, aspirations, that there was really no difference between her and her, I have to admit, very privileged background comparatively. Really felt no difference with these kids. And so that's something which I just want to throw in. I think it's overlooked how important that is for just communication between various groups in our society. She teaches at a camp school at Princeton in August, headed by the editor of the Washington Post magazine, is actually former editor of New Republic, named Richard Just, to teaches how to write. She's a good writer, my daughter, and teaches these kids how to write because it's generally accepted that there are a lot of problems that very poor kids have, most of them minority, coming out of high school. But one of them is writing. That if they can't learn how to write, they will never finish the 4 years. And I wonder if you have any commentary on that, and how what you do anticipates or can anticipate those kinds of obstacles for success after K through 1 through 12. I don't know who wants to speak first, but I'm looking at Nina, so maybe you should speak first, Nina. We'll have Mackie follow you.
Yeah, I'll start, but yes, Mackie probably has more data at her fingertips. So in terms of college attendance and graduation, one of the things that some of our highest performing networks have started to focus on, which is tremendous, is to make sure that their students are not just going to college, but also graduating from college. And they've ideas, one example again of a school that makes sure, for instance, that students are going in cohorts so that they have a community of peers with them, and that they're finishing that first year. Not finishing the first year, it's a great indicator of dropping out later on. But then the other thing that they've also realized is the importance of making sure that they're attending a school that fits their needs and their style and whatnot. So they're really curating an experience that leads to a college diploma rather than just checking the box by sending them to a great school. So this is, again, another area where the charter sector has really led. And we also have a lot of examples of charter alum who have gone on to do great things. We do need to do it more consistently, though. I think that our alumni are probably our best examples of what happens when you attend a charter school. No one can argue with them about the benefits of chartering. And I think tracking them and making sure that we're staying in touch with them is really important in terms of selling the value proposition of charter schools in the court of public opinion. One other thing I was just going to say about the diversity of our teacher workforce, there was a report by NCES last year that, and again, it's been proven time and again, that our teacher workforce is actually more diverse than the district sector. So there's definitely a pipeline that can and hopefully will be leveraged in order to also further diversify the leadership of our schools.
Well, just building on what Nina was saying, when we look at the data about student performance in charter schools, we do find that the scores in English language arts or reading are stronger than district schools for the most part, but they're also stronger than the math scores. And I just want to highlight that actually what the ambassador points to about having good solid foundation in English language arts and the ability to reason critically and to express yourself both orally and in written form are pretty strong predictors of success in college. I worry a little bit that the math performance is weak, because that is also a place where students, when they get into college, understandably, if they don't have strong backgrounds, they struggle. And so one of the places where I think there's an opportunity for innovation and collaboration, and I think this time of COVID is possibly a place to start, is to really think deeply about how you can leverage all of the great teaching across the entire charter sector in producing an exemplary curriculum for K-12 in both reading and math, so that schools that may not have really strong opportunities for instructional brilliance actually have a template that they can work from. I think the opportunity to deliver students to college better prepared is an advantage that charters can leverage. And certainly the idea that the commitment from charters to their students extends beyond handing them a diploma is a huge differentiator. You just don't see that in most public schools, district schools, excuse me. So again, as Nina said, I think this is a place where there's both advantage to the charter sector and an opportunity to step out and lead.
Well, CR, we're maybe running a little ahead of schedule, but there are, as I look at it, maybe 20 minutes of questions if you want to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, sounds good. And Nina and Mackie, there's about a handful of questions that have come up. Let's start here, which is a question around, from where you stand, what do you envision as the ideal collaboration between the traditional district and public charter sectors? What needs to happen at the national and/or local level to have this ideal of collaboration become reality?
I'll take a stab at it first. So we have some examples of district collaboration with charter schools, and Duncan Kruzman is one example. He's no longer a superintendent in Texas, but his is one example of a partnership he erected with Yes Prep and KIP in Texas. We have pockets, and again, when Mayor Hickenlooper was the mayor of Denver, and back then Superintendent Michael Bennett was superintendent instead of a senator, they also demonstrated how you can work with the charter sector, leverage it, and make sure that you are producing outcomes. And I know you have the superintendent of Miami-Dade on this panel, who's going to talk a little bit more about the things he's doing with KIP in Miami, although that relationship is a little bit different from the other models. Look, I mean, the reality is, in a lot of these inner city settings, the average tenure of superintendents is low. And so that's one of the problems. You can work with someone who's really energetic and driven and committed to creating great opportunities, but then if they leave and the next person comes, you have to start all over. I mean, one of the reasons why these charter networks are doing so well, certainly the larger networks that Mackie has studied, is because of the consistency in leadership that is kind of not impacted by the politics that come with school board elections and different members on your school board having different visions of what you need to do. So I think that's one of the problems within our district system in many places, unfortunately. But I also think just the conversations are not taking place in some communities as much as they used to take place, potentially, because in some places you could still grow and do your work without having to really pay attention to what the district was doing. But I think conversation can only lead to better outcomes. So for what it's worth, we encourage our networks and our charter support organizations and everyone who's involved in this space to really take the relationship and the politics a lot more seriously than in the past, because ultimately they're part of a community. And our education system is a political enterprise, and you have to make sure you're paying attention to the individuals at the local level who are part of that enterprise, whether it's a superintendent, whether it's a mayor, whether it's an alderman, someone else in the community who is going to be with you and be able to stand with you to demonstrate the value that you've added to that community, especially in those instances where the superintendents are cycling out pretty quickly.
I want to build on that by saying that we do have some strong examples even now of communities where the focus is on the community leaders in education owning all of the students and being committed to making sure that all students are supported and advocated for. And so I look at Cleveland as an example. I think that it's a really strong opportunity. I look at the work that Chris Surf did in New Jersey as another example where the focus was on insisting that everybody own all the students. And I think that's a really great place in dialogue, especially at this particular moment in time, where we can actually forge a better bridge of communication across the two main players in education. The other thing I would say is that I've been advocating for a long time that charters need to be better ambassadors in terms of inviting in teachers from districts to come and do fellowships or do an internship or just have a residency. I think it's a great way for individual bonds to be built that I think can strengthen discussions over time, but also to be a lot more transparent about the fact that there's no secret mystery, there's no voodoo in what happens inside a charter school. It's just hard slogging of doing good things day after day after day. And so I think demystifying the work of charters is also an important part of building those collaborations over time.
There's also a question from the audience, I think that both of you could respond to around the relationship between teachers' unions and the charter sector. And one audience member notes that a study by Kahlenberg and Potter demonstrated that many of the best charters in the Northeast are in fact unionized. So why so much resistance then to the idea of unionized charter schools?
Well, I'll jump in and I'll save Nina to do cleanup. So I think the fundamental problem about the cleavage between teachers unions and charter sector is around hiring and firing. That the model of flexibility and autonomy that charter schools have allows for a much more fluid creation of the teacher and leader force. And it's necessary in order to maintain the kind of dynamic flexibility, particularly that we saw in the pivot to remote learning that, that happened earlier this year. The opportunity for charter leaders to hire and give people a chance to be a great instructor, and if they're not great at instruction, taking action on behalf of the students to do something about that, I think is the place where teachers unions have the greatest irritation with charter schools. I know that charters schools that are unionized have some job protection, but those contracts are pretty thin. If you look at what Green Dot has done, those are really thin contracts. That's not the typical model of teachers unions. And the typical model is about protecting teachers at the expense of students. Maintaining teachers, even if they're not effective in the classroom, is not what charter schools are about. It's about making sure that kids learn. And so until we can get over that hump, I think that there will continue to be friction between the two groups. Nina, what do you think?
I think you covered it, Mackie. I'm interested in seeing that study again because the studies we've seen offer a very mixed outlook. And just keep in mind, in some states like Maryland, you cannot opt out of the collective bargaining union agreement. So anyway, this is an area that potentially deserves a little bit more scrutiny because there are variances in terms of the degree to which the contract is prohibiting you from doing certain things, which in some of these cases, the larger the district, the more inhibitive the contracts will become. We have examples of charters that have done this, though. Camino Nuevo Charter School in Los Angeles, when Ana Ponce was there, became unionized, and she has been able to keep her scores high and, sign a new contract every year. I think in those places where charters are bound by these rules and regulations, they have to just pay a lot more attention and negotiate the contracts every year in order to make sure that they have the freedom to do some of the things that they want. But Mackie is correct in that what happened in COVID is actually a very great example because you can expand your school day, your school year, offer a differentiated pay, and do all those things without having to negotiate with another entity. And that goes away when when you're bound by those contractual agreements. And to some extent, some of the slowdown in a lot of these districts has to do with that. But you cannot just blame the unions for it, because if that were the case in some of the states that don't have strong teachers unions, we could conceivably see charters grow exponentially. And in those places, again, the infrastructure or the system has had other ways of slowing you down. So I would say that, the local school boards association and other entities are just as capable of slowing you down and coming up with ways to dampen growth.
There was also a question from the audience and asking for some additional clarification and conversation around this relationship and interplay between civil rights organizations, African American community leaders, and the public charter school sector. And Nina, you talked about the conversations that are being had, some of the partnerships that are in place. But I guess the question being asked by the audience here is, what more can the charter school sector be doing to support the civil rights movement and civil rights organizations? And again, that's for both of you to respond to that.
Well, look, despite the narrative that the charter sector is led by, white people who are moving into a city and running schools, over 65% of the sector is led by single site leaders. And in many communities, these are leaders of color. And their stories need to be told, and they have been told, but it's just taken a while for them to, these are people who are running their schools, so to be doing the fights in the court of public opinion is not, second nature to them. And so we've been working a lot to make sure that their voices are heard, that they are part of the conversation, because to the extent they have launched their own schools and doing a fantastic job, I know Ian Rowe is one of the attendees here, they're really the face of this movement more than anyone else, and they should be leading this discussion and having, the impact that they should have on the discussion more than they have in the past. So again, we're only 6% of the public school community at the national level, but in those places where the numbers inch up to 10 to 15, 20%, in those places, I think it's incumbent on the community to really lean in and tell this story, because ultimately, that's what's going to make the greatest difference, rather than something that happens at the top in Washington.
Yeah, I'll echo some of that. I was asked to talk with the New York State Charter School Association sometime this past winter, before COVID. And I was quite surprised when I asked, this was a annual meeting of the school leaders from New York charter schools. And so there were probably 300 people in the audience. And I asked them by a show of hands, how many of you in the last 2 weeks have spent more than an hour on something that would be considered either public relations or advocacy or getting your story out? And the smattering of hands that went up was really shocking to me. I think there is, as Nina has said, a kind of a badge of honor in some sense that school leaders are so consumed with running their schools that they do not think that it is their job to do that work. And I have to say, this is a place where particularly leaders in communities where these civil rights conversations are critical and ongoing and potentially spark points, that they in fact have to get up and take a more active role. Their stories aren't just about them. Their stories are about their commitment to creating opportunity for the community. And that puts them immediately into partnership with some of the discussions from the civil rights groups. I think if that bond can be forged more strongly, and if school leaders and their teachers are willing to step up and join that conversation, I think the potential impact in those communities can be magnified dramatically.
So we have a couple more questions, and I think we have time to get to them. One is a follow-up. Nina, you said, and this is a quote from the audience, that comparing and contrasting is not going to change public opinion. And the audience member is asking that you expand a little bit on that idea that comparing and contrasting alone is not going to change public opinion.
So we've done quite a bit of polling and focus groups, and one thing that is very obvious when you talk to parents is that they simply want a great school that fits their child's needs. So going into these discussions, talking about how much the public system or the district system compares to the charter system and whatnot doesn't sway their opinion. That's what I was trying to get at. But depending on the audience that you're speaking to, of course, for a lot of lawmakers, the evidence is important. How many students are waiting to attend charter schools? How many do you have on your wait list, for instance, is an important data point. I just think, again, at the end of the day, it depends on who you're trying to convince, who you're trying to talk to. And I was just articulating that for the vast majority of the public, as the EdNext survey has demonstrated time and again, most people don't really know what a charter school is still. Most of them still don't know that these are public schools. A lot of people still think that charters charge tuition. So when you're going to this discussion with that much ambiguity about what it is, I think you just have to be a lot more careful in selling the value proposition as something that really is targeted at the needs of the individuals rather than some abstract discussion about two sectors that are competing against one another.
Mackie, here's one that I think you could probably take the lead on to start on is the studies have shown, and you've talked about your work in the paper today, that charter schools are scoring higher in proficiency, in reading proficiency. But is there concern that the charter school sector is not preparing students for the real world? So while the math and reading scores may be there, maybe there's some other set of skills and competencies that the sector may not be delivering on.
So I want to start from a slightly different place, which is that most of the studies that do these head-to-head comparisons of charter schools versus district schools, or charter growth for students versus district growth for students, the district growth is always taken as the baseline. And so imagine that the baseline for a district is not very high. And we know from a lot of the NAEP analysis that urban district schools are, in fact, at the lowest part of their state distributions. So being a little bit better than that doesn't necessarily assure that those students are going to be prepared. And so what I want to try to do here is to blend both overall academic achievement and proficiency with the kind of comparative data that we typically look at. And what I see in the charter sector is more of a focus on building a trajectory, reverse engineering a trajectory for students so that by the exit grade of the school, the student is in fact prepared for whatever comes next. So if it's at elementary school, the focus is on what do we have to do to make sure that all of our students, when they move on to middle school, are going to be ready for middle school material, and the same for high school, and then the same for moving out of high school into the post-secondary world. That kind of longevity in the planning frame is something that I think is not particularly common in the places where charter schools operate. That doesn't happen in the district schools. And so it's an important part of making sure that kids are ready. And I think it extends even beyond the two core academic subjects that we continue to measure. It's also incredibly common for charter schools to really do additional work on time management and personal organization and responsibility and the kind of character development that that we know can contribute to student success when they're out on their own. So I think the picture, the outcome in mind in many charter schools is much more robust, and it's more tied to post-secondary success than I think you can find in other schools.
Thank you, Mackie. With that, Ambassador Gray, I'm going to go back over to you for a final minute of closing thoughts and appreciation for our panelists, and then we'll go into our 15-minute break before our keynote.
Well, thank you, and thank Paul for the opportunity to participate in this very elucidating, interesting educational project. And I'm grateful to the two panelists for being so articulate and knowledgeable about all of these questions, the whole range, and how interconnected some of these issues are and should be made even more intense. And I think that what I take away from this is that we're not in the middle of the movement or the improvement. We're not towards the end of it. We're just seeing the end of the beginning of it, that there is a great deal that can be done. And like isolating the really, really good charter schools and what they do, that we're just at the beginning, really, of what could be a major revolution that could really transform education in this country, especially K-1 through 12 and maybe college too. So I just want to thank the two panelists and thank the originators of this program for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. This is really our only 15-minute break that we have during this conference today. So I'm going to encourage everyone to take the full 15 minutes, but please do join us at noon for Assistant Secretary Jim Blue, who will be giving our keynote address. So look forward to seeing everyone in 15 minutes.